and welcome to another episode on Jewish Charlotte Mason. My name is Bethany Mandel, and I am not paying an editor for these videos anymore, nor do I know how to edit them myself. So I hope you enjoy the rough cut. So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Charlotte Mason. Who was Charlotte Mason, and why am I, a Jewish mother, interested in her words and her work and her philosophy as it pertains to my homeschool? And especially pertinent because Charlotte Mason is a very popular philosophy within the Christian world, and how does this sort of translate to a Jewish household and a Jewish homeschool? So I'm going to be dropping a lot of links, as always. It's my favorite thing to do, in the comment description section of this video. And one of those links is going to be to this article that I'm going to be cribbing, basically. I will give her credit where credit is due. I'm not a plagiarist, but I just want to let you know that I'm not reading my own words right now, and I will link to the originator of these words. So first of all, this article is called Defining Charlotte Mason. Who was Charlotte Mason? So she was a woman in England in the 19th century. I don't feel as though I need to give you an entire biography of her life. It's kind of boring, to be honest with you, but do with it what you will. I will also include a biography in there in the links below. But for our purposes, what is a Charlotte Mason education? And I think that is what is most interesting to this conversation. Charlotte Mason education is distinct at its very core because it respects that a child is an individual made in the image of God, and that he has a right to know and experience a variety of things, not for the purpose of making him suitable for some future employment, simply because he is a person and is therefore entitled to a full life that includes knowing about everything that is good that the world has to offer that might help him reach the potential that God has designed him for. So there's no Jesus talk. It's God. It's Hashem, universal. This kind of education attempts to expose the child to a rich variety of knowledge in order for him to make meaningful connections to the world around him and develop an authentic relationship with God and with the people in his direct environment and from different times and places. Because the child is entitled to learn about whatever the universe has to offer, his curriculum is carefully arranged for him with the goal of offering variety, much like a delicious, bountiful feast. So if you've watched any of my previous videos, where did it go? Oh, shucks. The curriculum that we use is called a gentle feast. So that's the feast. Feast of things to study. Science, literature, the arts, practical skills are some of the mandatory dishes at this mental banquet. And I love that imagery, mental banquet. Sometimes there's things you like and sometimes there's things you don't, but you offer it to everybody. The teacher's role is to provide this feast, this well-planned feast. And that's something that I really like about Charlotte Mason, and it's something that a lot of people don't understand about homeschooling when they're unfamiliar with the concept. I'm not sitting and lecturing. I am providing the education in front of them. In the early years, you read out loud, but the child takes from it what they will. And as with public education or private education, some kids are better and interested in some things than other things, but we provide everything. But the responsibility for digesting this food of the mind rests on the child. The teacher acts as a guide and a fellow partaker of the feast. This is something that I really like, that I can also really enjoy and learn from everything that we're reading, from biblical readings straight from the source. I'm taking a lot out of it, to the art and the music. I enjoy it as well. It's, I'm a human. So we partake. So we're not the authority dispensing knowledge. Rather, we're not trying to lecture facts into this child's mind. Training the child to maintain focused attention allows lessons to be kept short enough to keep his mind fresh and alert. Short lessons, 15 minutes. I'm not trying to kill anybody here. Ideas that encourage wonder and reflection from the greatest minds of all time are transferred through interesting narrative books that spark life in the mind instead of dry and dull textbooks. So, for example, if we are learning about, let me see here. I don't have anything right here because I moved things around. Here's something. If we're learning about a time period, this was, I think it was the Civil War? I don't remember. This is something that we discussed one day, and we had a lovely conversation about the war as it was depicted in this beautiful image. So that is just a random thing that I grabbed off my cart. Here's another example. This is just a book that we are reading that is a narrative book about birds, and it's so much more interesting than a textbook. One of our favorite books that we've been reading is the Burgess bird book for children, and it is a series of chapters. I think that there's about 45 chapters in here, and you read a story in the voice of Peter Rabbit about his adventures through a wooded area in which he encounters lots of different birds, and he sort of tells you about the birds as he's telling the story. So he's describing them, their appearance, he's describing where they make their nest and what they eat and how they interact with the bird kingdom, and you're learning about birds in a much more interesting way than just looking at a textbook or a guidebook. These books are so vital to this kind of education that the term living books is sometimes used synonymously with Charlotte Mason. Rather than answering stock comprehension questions or outlining a wearisome list of facts, the child considers and clarifies himself what he read by telling it back in their own words. This is called narration. And I just want to sidebar for a second. That is such a Jewish idea, narration, telling back. If you think about one of the most important milestones in the Jewish year, it is the Passover Seder. You're sitting around waiting for food. It's so long until the food comes out. But what are you doing while you're waiting for the food? You are reading the story of Passover from your Haggadah. And this is exactly what we do every single year, twice a year during the Passover Seder. We sit and we tell back the Passover story, the story of Exodus, in our own words, and we have a conversation and we digest it. The idea of narration is so profoundly Jewish, and that is part of the reason why I was really drawn to Charlotte Mason as a Jewish homeschooler, because it was extremely Jewy. And it's not something that that I think that we have a name for in the Jewish education world, but it's narration. So she goes on. Language arts is learned not through isolated workbooks and practice sheets, although my children actually love doing those, to be frank, but integrated into his reading through role modeling by studying and copying well-written passages from the school books being used in other subjects. Science begins with an emphasis on first-hand experience with the wonders of God's world. This is something that this is how I connect with Hashem. This is how I connect with God. When I see a spider web, that's where I see God, because all of the things that have to exist in our world perfectly in order for that beautiful spider web to exist and to serve a vital function for the spider and for, the web of our sort of natural world, has to be perfect, and it is perfect because of God. This direct observation and sensory participation in nature continues even after more focused science is added to the curriculum. So I want to pause just for a second. I wrote for a Charlotte Mason magazine called Commonplace Quarterly, which is fantastic, and I love it, and it's a great publication, although I will say to my Jewish viewers, it is extremely Christian. So some people like to avoid those things. I personally do not. I take what I take and I leave what I leave, and I walk away with more than I came with. So your mileage may vary. But I wrote for a somewhat recent edition of their magazine about being a Jewish Charlotte Mason homeschooler, because their audience is a lot of women who have never met a Jew, let alone an observant Jew in any way. And I sort of wanted to explain from that perspective what is interesting about Charlotte Mason to me. And I, in my piece, share a story out of Kings about King Solomon. And I'm just going to read you that passage because it feels so very Charlotte Mason in this emphasis on nature that I don't feel is present in Jewish education currently. God made Solomon very wise. So now we're talking about Solomon's wisdom. Solomon could understand more than you can imagine. He was wiser than anyone in the East or in Egypt. He was wiser than anyone on earth. King Solomon became famous in all of the surrounding countries, and by the end of his life, he had written 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. Solomon also knew very much about nature. He taught about many different kinds of plants, everything from the great cedar trees of Lebanon to the little vines that grow out of the walls. He also taught about animals, birds, and snakes. When I read that, I was like, well, that's very Charlotte Mason. And I always have felt like this connection that I feel with the natural world as it pertains to my Judaism is not necessarily very Jewish. But when I read that, I realized, oh, it actually is. And the idea of homeschooling is also not very prevalent in the Jewish world. That's why you're not going to see many homeschooling Jews here or anywhere else. It's something that I desperately want to change because I think a couple things. And I'll touch on the second thing first, and then I'll come back to the first. So you know what I'm saying? This is why editing is helpful. I think that there is a day school crisis in not just finances, but also what is taught. And backing up that, I think that homeschooling is much more of a Jewish idea than people give it credit for because of how we've envisioned modern day Jewish education that is very heavily focused on Sunday schools and Jewish day schools. They are very expensive. It's not something that we can afford with the number of children that we wanted to have, but it was also not the kind of education that we wanted our children to have. And so a lot of people sort of push back on me with the idea that homeschooling is not very Jewish. And with that, I wanted to read a couple of different Jewish passages because I think that they provide my pushback a little bit. In Pirkei Avot, a 2,000-year-old compendium of Jewish knowledge, we are told, "Let your home be a meeting place for the sages." This emphasis on the home and the role of parents transmitting the education of Jewish history, faith, and values is ancient and woven into our foundational texts. I'm plagiarizing myself from Commonplace Quarterly. And in addition, I told you about the narration example with the story of Egypt, that one of the most important, if not the most important Jewish education that happens throughout the year is at the Passover Seder in our house, around our Shabbos table, our Passover table, telling back, narrating the story of Passover. In Proverbs, we are also told, educate a child according to their way. Every child is a born person, so this is me talking now, and their parents, more than any other teacher, know and understand the core of that child more than anyone else possibly could. In Genesis, we are also told Abraham is responsible to train his children and his households to walk in the way of Hashem. In Proverbs, it is written, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This places the emphasis of Jewish education not on rabbis, but on parents. And I think that that is something extremely important that we have lost. So coming back to Charlotte Mason as this 19th century old lady that was Christian, an interesting factoid that a lot of people don't know, including those who are interested in Charlotte Mason as a philosophy and as a person, is that her second hand, her right-hand woman, was actually Jewish. Her name was Henrietta Franklin. And one of my friends, Amy Snell, who runs a curriculum called the CMEC, which is wonderful, a little bit difficult to alter for Jewish households, which is why we don't partake in it. But it's a fantastic option if you're looking for a really pure Charlotte Mason education. Anyway, Amy sent me this passage several years ago that I wanted to read because I think it's really valuable in this conversation about how Charlotte Mason can work in a Jewish household. So I'm now quoting Henrietta Franklin from 1948. We believe in a religious basis of education, interpreted by each member according to his own fashion. Charlotte Mason, a devout Christian, and I, a liberal Jewess. We emphasize that a child is a person, not a member of a class. This was a very important thing back then, members of class in English society. with the needs of a person, which are physical and spiritual food and ideas on which we grow. Perhaps at no time in the history of the world is the emphasis on our first principle, the child is a person, more needed than today. I argue with you, Henrietta Franklin, that it is now more pertinent now than it was then. Whatever, I digress. Many have lost belief, not only in God, but in man and in themselves. A Hitler can gain power over us because we have lost any feeling of responsibility. Let the other man decide for me, and I will follow. This passage is from 1948, so the memory of the Holocaust is fresher than fresh. Charlotte Mason helps us produce a human being at his best physically, mentally, morally, and spiritually quickened by the school motto. So this is the motto of the school that they started. I am, I can, I ought, I will. This is, if you go on Pinterest and on Etsy, this is a very popular motto within the homeschooling Charlotte Mason world that I also love. Such a person may become, we hope, a world citizen ready to serve and play his part in a broken and sorrowing world. It's extremely powerful stuff. They really believed in a well-rounded education for children, but also for anyone. I want to take a little historical interlude into the past of Jewish education with a fantastic new book by Miriam Udell called Honey on the Page. Again, as always, all of the descriptions will have links to these books, and this is definitely one that I recommend picking up because while her introduction was extremely informative, the meat of the book is actually translations of Yiddish stories into English, and they're really powerful and exactly what Charlotte Mason would want to see in a Jewish homeschool. So anyway, it's called Honey on the Page. So she gives a little background about what Jewish education used to be in the time of our grandparents and to a lesser extent our great-grandparents. In North America, an aggregation of after schools filled with the afternoons and weekends of the public school student with Yiddishkeit, knowledge of Jewish history, heroes, ethics, folklore, and music, all transmitted in the Yiddish language. The school systems in turn established their own publishing houses and recruited seasoned Yiddish and Hebrew writers to create sustainable literary materials for their students. How Charlotte Mason does that sound? And I want to think a little bit about the fact that this used to be Jewish education in the time of our grandparents. And they all went to public schools, and yet they were producing more connected, more passionate. Very few of them ended up dropping their Judaism and assimilating and intermarrying. And it was because of this kind of education, which is so profoundly Charlotte Mason, this focus on ethics and folklore and music and literary materials. Charlotte Mason, that was a Charlotte Mason education in the Yiddish schools. And we have lost that, I think, in our modern Jewish education. So one of those literary journals, you're able to access that material. Nissan Mandel, no relation, I'm a Mandel, he's a Mandel, and I'm also not Mandel. That's not my real name, it's my married name. So he has a collection of short stories in these books. There's several of them, and they are selected from the monthly magazine Talks and Tales. It made its debut on Hanukkah 1941, and it appeared regularly ever since under the same editorship, and it was currently, when this was written, in its 40th year. So you can do math, this was 1981, before I was born. So this volume here that I'm reading contains 40 short stories corresponding with the 40th anniversary. It's a wonderful book, and so if you're looking for living literature for your Jewish homeschool, I recommend. So what now? You want to learn more about Charlotte Mason. So I want to just give a quick sort of caveat and warning in general. The Charlotte Mason world is, of course, as I mentioned, very Christian, but it is also, in my opinion, just my opinion, Bethany Mandel, a little, trying to find the right word, a little strict for my taste. I don't think that Charlotte Mason was a deity, and I don't think that she had all of the answers. And there's a lot of people, especially when they start becoming involved in Charlotte Mason, sort of think that her word was the final word. And I don't think that. So there was an example in a Charlotte Mason Facebook group that I was in where someone asked, what would Charlotte Mason's opinion be of building a playset in my backyard? And I was kind of like, why would you care what a 19th century long dead British woman would think about building a freaking playset in your backyard? Just build a playset. If your kids want a playset, build a playset. You don't have to overthink it. So there's so much writing of Charlotte Mason's that I really love, and I think that you should delve into. And I super recommend it. And I think that it can inform your homeschool and your philosophy and your beliefs and how you form your curriculum. I super highly recommend that. Do not come away from this thinking that Charlotte Mason was a deity that has to be followed to the letter, because that is not what I believe. That being said, I want to send you home with some homework if you're interested in reading more Charlotte Mason. One of the first places that I read about Charlotte Mason in detail was in this book. And again, the links are all going to be in the comments. For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay. It's short. You can sit and read it on a Shabbos. But it really gave me a lot of perspective on homeschooling in general, but also she talks so much about Charlotte Mason. So this is the first, I think, introductory book that I would recommend for Charlotte Mason. Another sort of introductory book, because her language can be difficult, is, oh, I'm sorry, I get all my books on Abe Books, so there's sometimes stickers. Charlotte Mason Companion by Karen Androla. And she, in here, has a great chapter 1 section, What Drew Me to a Charlotte Mason Education. And as you can see, I agreed. Living books, narration, no homework, free afternoons, no grades, and short lessons. Few lectures, ideas, and culture. Education is a discipline, and a sane discipline. I recommend as an intro. Another recommendation that I have is then to delve into Charlotte Mason's own words. So there's a lot of bootleg editions out there, and so I'm gonna only recommend these two to you, and do not look at the other ones, because there's a lot of, because it's in the public domain now, there's a lot of bad photocopies that are done. Don't do those. Here's my 2 suggestions. Number 1 is the Home Education series, which you can see, here's the rest of them, but here's 1 volume. And I recommend starting with volume 1, Home Education, and volume 6, Philosophy of Education. So this edition is on the newer side, and it's from Living Books Press. This is what the cover looks like. Again, I will link to it in the comments, because this is something that you can't buy anywhere else. Don't do it. Don't be cheap. You'll make a mistake. The other place is, and this is a Philosophy of Education, and it's annotated by Rachel Leibowitz. So I want to give a plug to what Rachel is doing with her business, Charlotte Mason Plenary, especially if you're Jewish, or if you're secular, or if you're just not, if you're not of the mind that Charlotte Mason was a goddess of some kind that needs to be followed to the letter. Rachel is doing so much incredible stuff with her Charlotte Mason Plenary, and she's working in conjunction with a burgeoning curriculum called Ani Ve'Ami, Ava for short. Again, I will link to all these in the comments. It's a growing, beautiful curriculum where you can get suggestions on living book ideas and different curriculum ideas, not just for Charlotte Mason, but homeschooling in general in the Jewish world. But I really recommend checking out what Rachel is doing. She's also working on Jewish artist study packets, which are great, because unfortunately, pretty much every single, if not every single, Charlotte Mason curriculum, including the one that we use, which is called A Gentle Feast. Give me just 2 seconds and I'll grab and I'll show you. So we love A Gentle Feast, and we used it this year. We will use it next year, but you sometimes have to make some modifications, because it is not necessarily a strict Christian curriculum, but it definitely touches upon it. So when we were studying artist study, this is the nativity scene, so I had to sort of go back and find a different piece of art from that artist that was not explicitly Christian. This was another example of something that I had to find something else. This is Jesus Rising. So Rachel's working on, and it should be released pretty soon, she's working on a Jewish artist study packet, which is fantastic. And so she also consults with Ani Ba'ami, and she is just a really sane, wonderful woman, and she has lots of different resources on her website that are always growing. Please check her out. She's fantastic. But this is her annotated edition of A Philosophy of Education, and the annotations are extremely helpful and appear on almost every page. And they help because it can be a little bit difficult reading Charlotte Mason's words that are written for a 19th century British audience when you are not that audience, and no one is that audience anymore. So I really recommend Rachel's annotated editions, honestly probably more than the River Bread Press, but your mileage may vary. You do you. The last recommendation that I have is some continuing education, sort of reading as you sort of talk it out with people. And one of the best ways that I have done that is with Charlotte Mason Boot Camp by Brandy Van Sel. I printed this out after we were done. And it's a 6-week boot camp going through all of Charlotte Mason's writing and reading. And I'm not the first observant Jew to go through her boot camp. And so she's sensitive to the fact that sometimes the conversations are very Christian-centric, and she's just a beautiful person, and I love her very much. And she has a great blog as well, a blog and a podcast. All of those things will be linked in the comments as always. But if you're looking for some sort of live feedback, not just sitting and reading by yourself, I found the boot camp extremely informative and enjoyable. So that is all of my thoughts on Charlotte Mason from a Jewish perspective. I mean, it's not all my thoughts, but it's most of my thoughts. In a perfect world, I would be blogging more at my blog, Jewish Charlotte Mason, and I would be videoing here more at my YouTube. But for now, that's what I have for you. I also have a Facebook group that is helpful, Jewish Charlotte Mason Homeschoolers. I'll link to that as well in the comments, description, whatever. But until next time, thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave comments. If you have other video ideas or suggestions for things that you think that I should talk about in future videos, that's a lot of what holds me up is I'm like, what do people want to hear about? I don't know. Tell me. Until next time, thank you so much. Have a good one.